Raymond Harlan was the quiet man no one noticed, retired, polite, invisible. Nina Caldwell was the relentless journalist who noticed what everyone else ignored. For 25 years he hunted and killed black women in East Marlow, and no one stopped. Him, not the police, not the press, not even the families who begged for help. But when Nina connected the names, the pattern, and the truth, she uncovered a horror buried by decades of silence and exposed how one man turned an entire town's neglect into his cover for murder. For over 20 years, the quiet industrial town of East Marlow kept a dark secret buried beneath its cracked sidewalks and abandoned buildings. Located in the shadow of a once booming steel plant, East Marlow was the kind of place that people forgot about once they left. But for those who remained, life moved in slow, harsh rhythms. The town had its share of problems: job loss, poverty, drugs. But no one could have imagined that a serial killer had lived among them for decades, unnoticed and unchallenged. Between 1982 and 2007, 25 black women vanished from East Marlow. Their names never made national headlines. Their disappearances were rarely front-page news in the local paper. Many were labeled as runaways, addicts, or women who simply left town. Some were last seen walking home from work, others leaving late-night parties or heading to a store. All of them disappeared without a trace. Over the years, their families filed missing person reports, distributed flyers, and begged the police to do more. But the response was almost always the same: disinterest, dismissal, and silence. The police records told a grim story of neglect. Officers marked many of the cases as low priority, or closed them altogether when leads went cold. No task force was formed, no alerts were issued, and no serious effort was made to connect the dots. One by one, these women vanished from the town's memory, reduced to names in dusty files or fading photographs tacked to corkboards. Their families were left with only questions and a gnawing feeling that something sinister had been ignored. 2008, a young journalist named Nina Caldwell arrived in East Marlow to write a story about economic decline. She was assigned to cover the effects of factory closures on small towns. But what began as a routine assignment took a sharp turn when she noticed something strange in an interview with a local resident. An elderly woman mentioned her daughter, Tamara Giles, who had gone missing in 1996. She spoke with pain, but also resignation, as if she had accepted that no one would ever care. That conversation haunted Nina. She looked up Tamara's case and found almost nothing, just a brief note in a police log and a missing person flyer buried in a digital archive. Curious, Nina started searching through public records and newspaper archives at the local library. She began collecting names of other missing women from the area. The more she searched, the more shocked she became. The cases spanned over 2 decades, all within East Marlow or its outskirts, and all involved black women. She found 25 in total. Some had vanished just weeks apart. A few were never even officially listed as missing by the authorities. It became clear to her that these weren't isolated incidents. There was a pattern, a terrifying one. Nina created a map of where each woman was last seen. Most of the disappearances clustered around a specific 5-mile radius on the south side of town, near the old industrial zone and a stretch of deteriorating properties. Several of the women had lived or worked in that area. The locations formed a path, like invisible breadcrumbs scattered across time. She took her findings to the local police, but they dismissed her concerns. One officer told her that many of the women had lifestyles that made them hard to track. That phrase stuck with her. It was a convenient excuse, a way to look the other way. But Nina couldn't let it go. She had stumbled onto something terrible, something that had been ignored for far too long. The story became personal for Nina. It was no longer about factory closures or economic decline. It was about 25 women who had been erased, not just by their killer, but by the very system that was supposed to protect them. She didn't know yet who was behind it. She didn't have hard evidence. but she had a feeling, a growing certainty, that someone had been hunting women in East Marlow and getting away with it. Nina Caldwell's discovery of the 25 missing women was only the beginning. With each passing week, she dug deeper into public records, property deeds, and utility histories. She wasn't a detective, but she had something just as powerful: persistence. As she traced the final known locations of each woman, a strange pattern emerged. Several of the disappearances seemed to orbit around a group of run-down properties located near the southern edge of East Marlow. The buildings were long abandoned, overgrown with weeds and covered in graffiti, but someone had been paying the property taxes. The names on the property records were vague: LLCs, shell companies, and P.O. boxes. But one connection stood out. A single name kept reappearing behind the paperwork, buried in old tax forms and utility bill payments: Raymond Harlan. Nina had never heard of him before, and when she asked around town, almost no one had anything to say. He was a quiet man, in his 60s, who had retired years ago from the city's sanitation department. He lived alone in a weathered farmhouse on the outskirts of town near the tree line, in a part of East Marlow that people rarely visited unless they had to. Raymond had no criminal record, no signs of violence, no whispers or rumors. To most, he was invisible. But Nina couldn't ignore how frequently his name appeared in documents linked to places near the disappearances. She compiled a full report and reached out to a retired detective named Elliot Monroe. Monroe had been with the East Marlow Police Department for over 30 years before retiring early. He was known for his quiet nature and was one of the few officers who had ever shown real interest in the missing women cases. Nina hoped he might listen when no one else would. Monroe reviewed her findings and agreed. Something wasn't right. He remembered several of the missing women, especially Tamara Giles. Back then, he'd been told to drop the investigation due to lack of leads. Seeing the names laid out so clearly now made his stomach turn. Monroe quietly reopened his notes and began digging through cold case files that had been collecting dust in the evidence room. Together, Nina and Monroe followed the trail. They found an old towing report from 1993. Tamara Giles's car had been found abandoned behind a building once owned by one of Raymond's shell companies. That connection was the first real piece of hard evidence. It was enough for Monroe to push for a closer look. He used what little leverage he had left at the department to get a low-level search of the storm drain area behind Raymond's property. What they found changed everything. In the muck and rot of the storm drain, buried beneath years of debris and soil, they uncovered bones, human bones. The coroner later confirmed they were from multiple individuals. DNA testing would eventually identify them as some of the women Nina had been tracking. The discovery forced the East Marlow Police Department to act. A search warrant was issued for Raymond Harlan's home. When investigators entered the farmhouse, they found a scene that was hauntingly organized. Tucked into boxes, drawers, and even beneath floorboards were small belongings: driver's licenses, bracelets, rings, and torn-up photographs. Items that had belonged to the missing women. Many of them had been tagged and dated, as if Raymond had kept a record. One drawer contained strands of hair, carefully bundled. Another held newspaper clippings of the women's missing person announcements. Despite the mounting evidence, Raymond didn't flee. He sat silently in a worn armchair as officers searched his home. He showed no fear, no resistance, no emotion. In his basement, behind a false wall, investigators found more remains, bones wrapped in plastic and stored in crates. It was clear this was no accident, no impulse. This had been methodical, planned, and it had gone unnoticed for more than 2 decades. What chilled Nina and Monroe the most wasn't just the evidence. It was how easily Raymond had hidden in plain sight. No red flags, no questions. Just a man who exploited the system's indifference and used it to cover up one of the most horrifying killing sprees in state history. As the investigation into Raymond Harlan's crimes expanded, a deeper and more uncomfortable truth began to emerge. This wasn't just about one man's horrifying actions. It was about a system that had failed repeatedly and without remorse. The focus shifted from Raymond's farmhouse to the East Marlow Police Department, where a trail of negligence and willful ignorance led to a chilling conclusion. The deaths of 25 black women could have been prevented. Internal reviews showed that nearly all of the women's disappearances had been reported within days of their last sightings. In many cases, family members had gone to the police multiple times, pleading for searches or media coverage. They were told to wait, that there wasn't enough evidence to launch a proper investigation. Some families were even told that the missing women were probably involved in drugs or had simply moved on. There were no alerts issued, no citywide efforts to track their movements, no media campaigns to raise awareness. Their cases were placed at the bottom of the stack, forgotten. Nina Caldwell obtained a leaked memo written in 2002 by then police Chief Martin Greaves. In it, Greaves instructed officers to deprioritize cases that involved individuals with known lifestyle issues, a vague phrase that was applied almost exclusively to poor or minority victims. The memo also emphasized the department's limited resources and the need to focus on cases with the highest probability of resolution. In practice, it meant ignoring the women who were most vulnerable. That memo would later become a key piece of evidence, not in the trial against Raymond, but in the public reckoning that followed. When the news broke that a serial killer had been operating for over 2 decades without interference, outrage erupted across the city. The community that had once been quiet and reserved now filled the streets with signs, chants, and tears. Vigils were held at City Hall. Families of the victims finally spoke openly about the pain they had carried for years. Angela Barnes, the East's sister of victim Renee Barnes, addressed a crowd during one of the protests. Her voice trembled as she read a list of names. They were daughters, they were mothers, they were ours, and no one came for them. National media outlets descended on East Marlow. The small town became a symbol of racial injustice and systemic failure. Commentators and activists pointed out that if even a handful of these women had been white, the reaction would have been immediate and overwhelming. Instead, their deaths were seen as expected, their absences explained away with prejudice disguised as procedure. Raymond Harlan's trial began in 2012. He was charged with 25 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors presented a chilling narrative of how he had chosen his victims. Women he believed no one would fight for, women who wouldn't be missed. He confessed in cold detail, describing how he watched them, followed them, and lured them to places he knew would never be searched. He spoke without emotion, without regret. His only explanation was that he found it easy. But the trial was about more than Raymond. It was about the silence that had surrounded him. Police officials were called to testify. Former officers admitted they had failed to pursue leads, that they didn't see the cases as serious, that they made assumptions about the victim's worth. No one was charged with obstruction or misconduct, but careers were ended and reputations destroyed. The town of East Marlow would never be the same. Trust in the police was shattered. Community. Groups sprang up, demanding reform. The mayor ordered an independent review of the police department's practices. But no investigation could undo the years of suffering or bring back the lives that had been so carelessly dismissed. In the courtroom, as Raymond Harlan was led away in handcuffs, the families of the victims didn't cheer. There was no celebration, only the heavy weight of truth finally acknowledged, and the unbearable knowledge that justice had come far too late. Raymond Harlan's sentencing marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in East Marlow's history, but the impact of his crimes continued to ripple far beyond the courthouse. In 2012, he was handed 25 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge called the case a catastrophic moral failure, not only of one man's actions, but of a system that had allowed him to continue for decades unchecked. One by one, the names of the victims were read aloud during the final hearing. Family members wept as each name echoed through the courtroom, like a roll call of lives erased by violence and forgotten by authority. After the trial, the property where Raymond had lived was seized and later demolished. The house, which had once held secrets no one dared to imagine, was torn down brick by brick. In its place, the community built a memorial garden. A circle of stone pillars was raised, each inscribed with a victim's name. At the center stood a sculpture of a blooming flower breaking through concrete, symbolizing resilience and remembrance. The garden became a place of healing, but also a solemn reminder of the silence that allowed a predator to thrive. Nina Caldwell published a detailed account of the investigation in a book titled The Forgotten 25. The book not only documented the crimes and the timeline of the investigation, but it also highlighted the deep-rooted systemic issues that had contributed to the tragedy. It became a national bestseller and was later adapted into a documentary that aired on multiple platforms, drawing widespread attention to similar patterns in other cities across the country. Nina didn't want fame. Her goal was to make sure no one could ever say they didn't know this kind of thing could happen. In response to public outrage, federal authorities launched a broader inquiry into how law enforcement agencies handled missing persons cases involving women of color. New protocols were introduced to standardize how such cases were reported and investigated, with specific training on recognizing and addressing bias. The FBI established a special task force aimed at reviewing cold cases involving minority victims, and several states passed legislation that required transparency in missing persons investigations. But not everything was resolved. Even as reforms began to take shape, there were lingering questions that haunted the families and the town itself. Why had Raymond begun his killing spree? What was the moment that turned him into a murderer? Psychologists who analyzed his writings and behavior concluded that Raymond had no particular trauma or mental illness that could explain his actions. He had simply identified a vulnerability in society and exploited it. That made him even more terrifying. He was not insane, but calculating. His only motive had been opportunity. Some residents of East Marlow reported difficulty sleeping for months after the trial ended. Others left the town altogether, unable to live in a place that had harbored such horror. But for many, staying was an act of defiance, a way to reclaim their home and their history. Local schools began including a unit on the case in their social studies curriculum. Churches held annual services in honor of the victims. Every May, a candlelight vigil is held in the memorial garden, where families come together to mourn and to stand united. Raymond Harlan never appealed his sentence. He now spends his days in a maximum security prison, confined to a small cell with no contact from the outside world. He receives no visitors, no letters, no calls. It is as if he has vanished, much like the women he took. Except now, he is the one who has been forgotten. But the names of his victims live on, not just in stone, but in conversation, in reform, in the renewed commitment to never ignore another missing woman again. What happened in East Marlow became a symbol, a case study, and most importantly, a wake-up call. The horror that went unnoticed for decades has finally been seen, and the silence that protected a killer has been shattered for good.